All right, let's get right into a huge question today, one that really cuts to the core of modern American history. What was the real legacy of the identity movements of the 1970s? I mean, let's put it bluntly. Did they actually succeed in their goal to fundamentally change the country? It sounds like a pretty straightforward question, right? But believe me, the answer is anything but. Just think about the incredible optimism of that era. You had activists fighting for women's equality, for LGBTQ+ visibility, for racial justice. They truly believed they were building a brand new, more just America. But then you fast forward to today, and yeah, some things have definitely changed, but the very same debates are still raging, and sometimes they feel even more intense than ever. So what happened? To really get a handle on our present, we have to start with the immediate reaction to those movements. Our story kicks off with a powerful political backlash that would go on to define the entire next decade. The 1980s brought this just seismic shift in American politics, something we often call the Reagan Revolution. And this wasn't just, a change in who was president. It was a fundamental change in the country's entire direction. And this new agenda, it went way beyond just economics. The real flashpoint was this push for conservative social values. It was a direct counterargument to the social changes that the movements of the 60s and 70s were demanding, and it ignited these fierce debates over everything from abortion rights to the Equal Rights Amendment. And this sentiment right here, it really captures the feeling that was driving that whole shift. For a lot of Americans, the push for change felt like an attack on the values they held dear. So this counter-movement was their answer. Okay, so let's move to the next phase, because this is where things really start to build. After the Cold War ended, the battleground for America's identity kind of shifted from foreign policy to these intense conflicts happening right here at home. So let's get our bearings for a sec. The Cold War ends, and suddenly the US is the world's only superpower. With no single external enemy to rally against, America's focus turns inward. And at the same time, you've got forces like globalization and the internet creating all these new anxieties and new arenas for conflict. This is exactly when the political fight morphs into what we all now call the culture wars. The debates started shifting away from just policy and became these huge battles over core values, about what it truly means to be an American. Okay, so that brings us into the 21st century, where this historical tug of war we've been talking about, this back and forth between change and resistance, well, it didn't just continue, it intensified dramatically. The new millennium kicks off with two massive events that just completely reshaped the national conversation, right? All the attention was on foreign policy and economic survival, but those underlying cultural tensions, they were still simmering just below the surface. And then came a moment that, for so many, was this incredible, undeniable proof of progress, the election of Barack Obama. I mean, for millions, this was a landmark achievement, a sign that the dreams of the civil rights movement were finally being realized. But his presidency also threw into sharp relief just how divided the nation had become. It was followed almost immediately by this powerful surge in polarization, with Americans fiercely disagreeing on the very definition of what progress even looks like. And you can see that exact same push and pull dynamic playing out right now, can't you? All these recent movements, from Trump-era populism to Black Lives Matter and #MeToo, they are all part of this same long-running tug of war between the forces of change and the forces of resistance. Whew, okay, so after tracing this long, complicated history, how do we even begin to make sense of it all? Let's turn to how the experts, the historians, try to interpret this story. So right back where we started, asking that central question. But here's the thing. When you ask historians, there is no simple consensus. They're just as divided as the public. Historians basically break this down into two main arguments. On one hand, you have the case for success. They point to fundamental changes in laws and public attitudes, and to political representation that was once unimaginable. But on the other hand, you've got the case for limits. This side points to persistent inequality, to institutional resistance, and to the powerful backlash that has often stalled or even reversed progress. So what this really suggests is that it's not a simple choice between success and failure. The reality is, both can be true. The real takeaway here might be that the movements achieved these profound, incredible victories while also facing powerful and enduring limits. And that is why understanding this history is so absolutely vital. These debates over rights, over equality, over who belongs, they are not over. They aren't dusty relics of the past. They're the very fabric of our current political and social world. Which leaves us with a final and, I think, critical question to consider as you think about all this history. In any narrative of progress or failure, we have to ask ourselves, whose perspective is being centered, and maybe even more importantly, whose story is being left out?